Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We are currently in Module 4, and this lesson, we are going to cover namespaces. Now, namespaces are something that people often overlook, but they are a very easy way to organize your project in a way that makes sense and allows us to do some really neat stuff with how we organize or put things together. So let's open up Visual Studio and go File, New Project, and we'll look at something we've already seen but just kind of ignored. So .NET Framework Console Application, Console UI, and this is the namespace demo. Once we're done here, we're going to say console.readLine at the end, and let's create a new class. So add class, and we're going to call this class person model again, and make it public. And just so we have something in it, we'll say first name and last name. There we go. So now the namespace that I'm talking about is the idea that we have a fully qualified name for everything. So for the person model, we can't just say first name over here. So I can't just say first name. That doesn't work. We have to know where it's located. I can say person model dot first name if we make it static or if we instantiate it. In fact, you know what? For right now, let's create one static class instead. No, let's leave it alone. We can understand this. So person equals new person. So person dot first name. All right. Now let's create a different class, just kind of illustrate a little easier. We'll create a class called calculations. And so if you notice, it says up here, namespace is console UI. And since this namespace is the same as this namespace, which is the same as this namespace, it assumes when you say, I want a calculations object or calculations method, that it knows, okay, calculations is in console UI namespace. Therefore, you don't have to say it. Just like with a person model, we assume, because it's actually console UI.person model. But again, it grays it out because it's saying, you don't have to say that because I know that. So that's the namespace. So if we had another project down here, and we were talking between the two, and we're going to get to that in the next lesson, but for now, just pretend we did, then that project would have a different name than console UI. I mean, use that project name dot the class name dot the method name. And that's a simplified version. But here's the reality. Namespaces can be anything we want them to be. So for example, over here it says console UI. calculations. I could say, let's call this the foundation info namespace. No problem. We can do that. Now it's going to yell at me over here and say, you know what? The name calculations does not exist in the current context. The current context is console UI. But if I were to come over here and say foundation info dot calculations, no problem. But that's awful long. Why would I ever do that? Well, because you don't have to type that whole thing out. We have the idea of using statements. If you notice right up here, there's a bunch of using statements, and we've ignored those up until now. What a using statement is a shortcut. Now, if you come from a different language or have seen a different language, you may get confused by these. If you were to learn C or C++, these would be import statements where you actually bring in code from somewhere else. And that would indicate you're bringing in code from somewhere else. That is not what these are doing. These are not bringing in code. All this is doing is saying, we don't want to type these things out. So therefore, assume that's part of our current namespace. So for example, when I said console.writeLine, I said console.writeLine. I didn't say the full namespace, which is system.console. So the full path is system.console.writeLine. Why didn't I need to say that? Because up here I have using system. So it said, if it's in the system namespace, assume or treat it like are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? So using directive, if I do this little drop down here or hit Control dot when I've highlighted it, it says the first one is using system.collections.generic. If I click on that, it's going to put a using statement up at the top. And in fact, it does. But if I didn't want to do that, I could come down here and try again and say, let's change that to the fully qualified name. I have to change it over here as well. And isn't that a pain? System.collections.generic.list. Twice. That's frustrating. So no, I don't want to do that. I want my using statement at the top instead. That makes life easier. But you see what this did? This using statement uses the namespace and allows it to bring it in and make it shorter, but it allows us to put things into buckets. So this list right here, this list type is in the system namespace, but not just the main root of system like console is. Instead, it's in the collections. What's a collection? A bunch of items, or another word for a list. That makes sense. But it's not just in system.collections, it's in system.collections.generic. So it's a generic collection in system. Now, if we were to look, and let's do that, system.collections.generic. Notice the options we have. Comparer, dictionary, hash set, equality comparer, iCollection, and there's a whole lot more. But notice they all have the less than, greater than sign after them, the angle brackets, which indicate a generic. So they've grouped all of these together. Instead of throwing them in one big pile and saying they're in there somewhere, this allows us to separate them out. Now, remember I said before, we use class files to separate out different things. Well, this allows us even further to segment out things into either just a totally different namespace or into a sub namespace. So, for example, this foundation info might be .calculators, .personal calculators, .tim's calculators. Now, that's quite extreme. But that's possible. And over here, it's going to yell at us again. But if we do a drop down here, let's add that using statement up there. And now we're all good. So I could have broken that way down like this. Now, I can have more than one class that has that same namespace. So I could copy this namespace, and I could use it over here on person model instead of that console UI. Now, it doesn't make sense there, but that's a possibility, and I can manipulate that just fine. The namespace can be whatever you want. By default, it's the same name as your project. If you go into properties of your project, notice here default namespace is console UI. So that's that default namespace that comes up every time you create a new object. You could change that if you wanted to. Change it to something else. Now, it's not just that we can create these namespaces by just typing them out. That would be a little laborious, especially since we have the problem of mistyping changes the namespace. By default, we don't typically change these namespaces. Instead, what we do is we create folders. So if I right-click on Console UI and I say Add New Folder, I could say Models. Now, if I were to move this person model over to the Models folder, the only thing it does is reorganize our project. It doesn't change the namespace, because once a object is created, it doesn't change the namespace again. However, if I were to create a new class in this folder, notice I right-click on Models and say Add Class. Let's create the address class. Notice the namespace, console UI dot models. So it's organizing my namespace using the folder structure. This way, it makes it very simple to match your namespace up with your folder structure. That can be really helpful, and that's the typical way we use namespaces, is we use folders. And if you nest folders, it will have, console UI dot models dot important models, or whatever you want to call it. In general, you will see projects mainly use folders. You don't see very many projects that have just the bare set of, 100 classes in one big project. Instead, we group them together into similar things and create folders for them and then put them in there with the correct namespace. So I would actually change the namespace of the person model to be console UI.models, which would break temporarily this until I did control dot and added my using statement for models. And now we're good to go. All right. But that allows us to have this structure so that if you didn't see all this code, all you saw was, like we saw here with system, all you saw was the actual code this way. You could look through and go, okay, collections, that sounds like what I want. Dot, what kind of collection do I want? And there's generic and there's concurrent and there's object model. Notice the brackets, the curly braces. So let's look at specialized. Dot, and here's an organization that puts all the specialized collections together. So a string dictionary or a string collection, an order dictionary, things you won't normally use are specialized for a special purpose, and they put them all together in one spot. That makes it a lot easier for me to know where to look for something. So if I wanted a list, but not a list, I wanted something similar to a list that was also generic, I know I would go to system.collections.generic. Now you don't have to memorize any of these things. So don't start thinking, oh, I need to memorize the .NET framework and all the different places it has stuff. Don't do that. But you get used to it after a while, and you're allowed to do this dot and then drop down and start looking and go, you know what? That sounds kind of cool. I think I kind of need a hybrid dictionary. I've never used a hybrid dictionary, I don't think. Maybe once. Probably not. So, but there's tons of stuff in here that is organized well by namespace. And so the encouragement to you is to use your folder structure and your ability to change namespaces if you have to create a structure that easily maps out to something that's understandable. Now, just so you know, you can use Microsoft's naming structures if you really wanted to. I would encourage you not to. But for calculations, let's just say you say, you know what, that really fits inside of the system namespace. You could do that. Now you might step on toes if they have methods help you organize your project. These are all tools to help you not just have a bunch of spaghetti code, meaning code that just is intertwined and is a mess to read and a mess to work with. Instead, you break it into little pieces and you put those pieces in logical places so that it's easy to find and work with. Think of it as a well-organized wood shop versus just the garage where everything gets dumped. Okay? Which one's easier to use? The well-organized wood shop. That's what you're trying to do here. You're trying to create a well-organized code base to work with, because code is meant to be read by humans, not computers, humans. So we need to create a code base that's easily readable, easily understandable, and separated enough so we don't need to bring everything along with us. We need just one piece. Okay? So that's what namespaces, classes, and methods help us do. All right, your homework for today is to create a class file and then change the namespace to be something different and then call a method in that class, just to see the idea of adding a using statement or using the full name or full namespace name of that class and method. Okay? So give that a shot. Make sure you understand it. Play around with it a little bit. Make sure that you're comfortable with using statements and how that all works. And then once you've done that, then move on to the next lesson.